welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going deep into cybersecurity risk management, specifically in the EU. You've given us a bunch of sources to work with, actual regulations and guidelines.
Yeah, and we're going to break all that down into something you can use. It's a roadmap of sorts.
Yeah.
For essential and important entities in the EU.
Sort of like a cheat sheet to help protect against cyber threats.
Exactly.
One thing that really stood out to me was how much emphasis there is on having a clear security policy. That high-level one, it seems like that's the core of your whole cybersecurity approach.
It's really, it's the guiding principle. It has to be endorsed by management. Shows that cybersecurity is important to everyone from the top down.
And it's interesting, not just one big policy.
Right.
You need specific ones for all kinds of different areas.
Mm-hmm.
Incident handling, cryptography, business continuity. It really shows how big this whole thing is.
Yeah, and they also really stress clearly defined roles, responsibilities, authorities. It can't just be someone will handle security. Each person needs a specific role and a reporting structure and the ability to make decisions.
It's like, a chain of command. But for cybersecurity, I even saw that. At least one person has to report directly to management on cybersecurity issues. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is. It's all about making cybersecurity part of how the organization works. Everyone needs to understand they have a role to play in protecting the organization, which leads us to risk.
Risk, it seems like these EU regulations are all about facing that risk head on. They say you have to do regular risk assessments.
And not just like a vague idea of what could go wrong, but a process. You have to identify, analyze, and really thoroughly document all those threats. This includes vulnerabilities, those single points of failure. That could take down entire systems.
The single points of failure. That's the kind of thing that you think, but just finding the risks, that's only the first step, right? Then you have to decide what to do about them.
Right. And that's where risk treatment comes in. You can avoid the risk, do things to mitigate it, transfer the responsibility to someone else, or even just accept it. If the potential impact is small, it's a strategic decision, balancing security with business needs.
So you're weighing the consequences against the cost and effort of actually doing something about the risks. Makes sense. But sometimes things still go wrong, even with the best plans, which means you have to think about incident response.
Yeah, and the EU guidelines are pretty realistic about this. They acknowledge that incidents are going to happen. It's not if, but when.
That's a good point. It's more about being prepared than hoping nothing bad happens. So let's say an incident happens. What happens?
The most important thing is a clear incident handling policy. This says how to categorize incidents, how to communicate, who to escalate to, who to report to. It's like a playbook for when things go wrong.
And they seem to really care about early warning systems. They say you have to have a way for employees, suppliers, even customers to report anything suspicious.
That's right. Because in today's world, security is so interconnected, everyone has to be on the lookout for potential problems.
It's all about being vigilant. But there's a difference between a suspicious event and an actual incident. How do you figure that out?
That's where you have to evaluate things. Before jumping into full-on incident response, you have to decide, is this really an incident? And if so, how bad is it?
You don't just jump to conclusions. Incident response isn't about panicking. It's a process.
Exactly. And that process involves containing the damage, getting rid of the threat, recovering systems, and communicating with everyone involved. Sometimes that even means notifying the authorities or the public, depending on how bad it is.
That makes sense. But what if it's not just an isolated incident, but something much bigger, like a fire or a flood or a cyber attack? That takes out your whole system. That's where business continuity comes in.
Right. Right. The EU regulations say you need to have a strong business continuity plan, and that includes a business impact analysis.
How does that involve?
You figure out what services are critical, how much downtime is acceptable before things start falling apart. We call those recovery time objectives, and how much data loss you can handle. Those are recovery point objectives. It's all about minimizing the disruption, even in a disaster.
I can see how that would make business owners really think
about
their operations. How much downtime could they actually afford? What would happen if they lost important data?
Those are the questions. And the EU goes even further. They want you to have backup copies, redundant systems, even redundant personnel.
Redundant personnel? You mean like backups for your backups, training multiple people to do critical jobs?
Exactly. You need to build in resilience, layers of protection. So if one system fails or one person is unavailable, the organization can keep running. But even with all the technical safeguards, you can't forget about.
The human factor. People are a big part of this.
Right.
I mean, human error causes a lot of security breaches.
That's true. And that's why the EU really stresses awareness-raising programs. It's not just about technical skills. It's about creating a culture where everyone understands cybersecurity and they all take responsibility for their actions.
And the regulations even say, you need a process for disciplining people if they violate security policies. That's pretty serious.
It is. It shows that cybersecurity matters to everyone. And there are consequences if you don't follow the rules. But
besides the big stuff, policies, risk management, incident response, the EU regulations cover a lot more. There's some really interesting stuff in there we should talk about.
Sounds good. I'm ready to dive in.
Like secure acquisition. Let's say you're getting some new tech. The EU says you have to think about security from the beginning, before you even buy it.
So it's not just about getting the newest thing. It has to be secure too, right from the start.
Exactly. Security has to be part of the design, not something you add on later. And this applies to software too. There's something called a secure development lifecycle, where security is part of every stage, from design to deployment. So you're building security in from the ground up, instead of trying to fix things later.
Right. It's called shifting security left. You make it part of the process, not an afterthought. And it's not just about vulnerabilities. It's about making systems that can recover if an attack happens.
So you're thinking about resilience from the very beginning. It seems like the EU wants organizations to think differently about security, make it a core part of their operations.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to really understand these regulations and how they affect you. And speaking of effects, one thing that really stood out to me was compliance monitoring. It's one thing to have policies and procedures, but how do you make sure people are actually following them?
Yeah, that's a good point, especially in a big organization. How does the EU think you should do that?
They say you need regular reviews to see if people are complying with security policies, rules, standards. It's all about accountability, making sure everyone is following the rules.
You don't just write a policy and forget about it. You have to check if it's working. How would you even do that?
It's like a cybersecurity health check, regular reports to management, showing the current situation. Think dashboards with metrics, charts showing compliance, risks, recommended actions.
I can picture it. But checking yourself is only one part of it.
Right.
What about getting someone else to look at things?
You're right. The EU says you also need independent reviews, people who are totally separate from the ones being reviewed so they can be more objective about the organization's security.
Like an external auditor, coming in to give you a fresh perspective. But what happens if they find problems?
Then you take corrective action, the findings from those reviews. And from compliance monitoring, all that gets reported to management, and they have to fix the problems.
So it's a cycle. You evaluate, identify, improve. You're always trying to make your defenses stronger, based on what you learn. It all ties back to that idea of a security-conscious culture.
Exactly. You can have the best firewalls, the best intrusion detections. But if your employees are clicking on phishing links or using bad passwords, it won't matter. Technology's only part of it.
It's like having a fancy security system, but leaving your front door wide open.
Exactly. That's why awareness is so important. You have to teach employees about the risks. Make it clear why cybersecurity matters. And give them the tools to make smart decisions. Security is everyone's responsibility.
The guidelines talk about having a way to report suspicious things. That sounds like a good start. Anyone can flag a potential problem without a lot of hassle.
Right. You want to make it easy for people to say something if they see something. And it's more than just reporting incidents. It's about good security habits, strong passwords, thinking before you click, being careful what you share.
Always being on guard, making security part of everything you do.
Yeah.
But awareness is only part of it. You also need training.
Right, definitely. And the EU has specific rules about training, for example. People with security-related jobs, they need regular training on secure configuration, threat identification, incident response.
Different jobs need different training. Makes sense. Someone who manages systems needs to know more about security then. Someone who works with spreadsheets.
Exactly. And the training has to be relevant to the specific risks and the technology that organization uses. It's not one size fits all.
What about the software itself? The guidelines mention secure development. What should organizations be doing to make sure their software is secure?
That's a great question. It's all about the secure development lifecycle. Security has to be part of every stage of development, from design and coding to testing and deployment.
So you're making the software secure from the ground up. instead of patching things up later.
Exactly. It's shifting security left, making it part of the process, not something you add on at the end. And it's not just about preventing problems. It's about making software that can recover if there is an attack.
I see a theme here. Being proactive, looking at the big picture. The EU wants organizations to help really change how they think about security.
Absolutely. Security has to be part of everything, the culture, the processes, the technology. That's why these EU regulations are so important.
We've talked about a lot. Policies, risk management, incident response, awareness training, secure development. Anything else we should cover before we move on?
We can't forget cryptography. The regulations have a lot to say about how to use cryptography to protect data.
Cryptography. That's one of those things that always makes me feel like I need a decoder ring or something, it seems. Really complicated. But I know it's important for keeping data safe.
It can be. Kind of a brain twister. But basically, cryptography uses math to scramble information so no one can read it unless they have the right key, or it's like a digital lockbox for your sensitive data.
Okay, I get it. So the regulations aren't just saying use cryptography.
Yeah.
They tell you how to use it right.
Yeah. They actually talk about key management. That's how you create the keys, store them, share them, and eventually get rid of them. Because if someone gets those keys, the whole system is at risk.
It's like having a super strong lock on your lockbox. But leaving the key under the mat? So how do you manage those keys safely?
Well, first, you need strong keys. That means they're long and random, so nobody can just guess them or crack them with a computer. And then you have to store them securely. Sometimes that means special hardware made just for protecting keys.
And you have to be really careful about who has access to the keys. I mean, you trust your team, but you still need to be sure.
Right. Of course. You need rules about who can get to the keys, and you have to watch those access logs for anything that looks fishy.
Sounds like a lot of responsibility. But cryptography isn't just about data sitting on a server.
Right.
It's also about data moving around, like when we're online.
Exactly. The EU guidelines say you have to use secure protocols, like TLS-SSL. They use cryptography to encrypt data as it goes across the internet so no one can snoop. Or do those man-in-the-middle attacks.
So it's like sending a message in a sealed envelope, even if someone intercepts it, they can't see what's inside.
Perfect analogy. And as technology changes, we're seeing cryptography used in more and more places. Like for verifying who you are. Digital signatures, even blockchain stuff. It's a core part of the digital world.
And the EU wants organizations to really up their game when it comes to cryptography, making sure they're using it right to protect their data. We've talked about technical stuff, policies, cryptography. Makes me think about the people involved.
You're right to bring that up. It's something the regulations mention again and again. Training and awareness are essential, but people are the biggest weakness and the greatest strength in any security system.
That's interesting. Can you say more about that?
Sure. We've seen how human error can cause security breaches. People click on phishing links, they use weak passwords, they make mistakes that expose data. But those same people can also spot a phishing email, report something strange, or come up with new ways to solve security problems.
So it's about giving people the knowledge and tools so they can be part of the solution, not the problem.
Right. You want to create a culture of cybersecurity where everyone understands their role and takes responsibility for their actions, because security isn't just about technology, it's about people.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into cybersecurity risk management in the EU. We've learned a lot, and you should have a better understanding of this whole area and how those regulations apply to you.
And remember, security isn't something you do once and you're done. It's an ongoing thing. You have to keep assessing, keep adapting, keep improving, stay aware, stay informed, and stay ahead of the threats.